My name is Astrid Finch, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Has anyone ever called you lazy while you were literally risking your life to keep their business running? Has someone ever made you the villain in their social media story while you were secretly documenting their illegal practices? Because that's exactly what Geneva Vance did to me. We were standing in the break room at Pinnacle Manufacturing, 23 employees watching our boss film herself for TikTok, blaming us for attitude problems and work ethic issues. What she didn't mention in her viral video was the broken safety equipment, the blocked emergency exits, the chemical spills we'd been begging her to fix for months, or the OSHA violations I'd been photographing every single day. But Geneva was about to learn that some employees don't just complain, some of us document everything, and some of us know exactly who to call when enough is enough. Her TikTok went viral, all right, just not the way she expected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone camera was pointed directly at us as Geneva Vance delivered her performance. 23 exhausted workers, still covered in metal shavings and chemical residue from our 12-hour shift, became unwilling extras in our boss's latest social media spectacle. Maybe if my lazy employees worked half as hard as they complain, we wouldn't have these problems, she said into her phone, that same condescending smirk she'd worn while tossing my safety reports in the trash for the past 6 months. Her perfectly manicured nails, the same ones that had never touched a piece of machinery or handled hazardous materials, gestured dismissively toward our group. The break room fell silent, except for the buzzing of the fluorescent light that had been flickering for weeks, another non-essential repair that Geneva had deemed unnecessary. Behind her, through the grimy window, you could see the loading dock where the emergency exit had been blocked by inventory for 3 months straight. OSHA violation number 47 on my list, but who was counting? Some people just don't understand what it means to have a strong work ethic, Geneva continued, her voice dripping with fake sincerity as she adjusted her angle for better lighting. When you're running a successful manufacturing operation, you need team players, not complainers. I watched from the corner table where I always sat during breaks, my safety logbook hidden beneath my lunch bag. The same logbook that contained photographs, timestamps, and detailed documentation of every violation, every ignored repair request, every corner cut in the name of efficiency. The same logbook that Geneva had no idea existed. Tyler Thorne, one of our veteran machinists, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Just yesterday, he'd shown me the fresh burn on his arm from the faulty cooling system that Geneva had postponed fixing until next quarter. Joanne Hayes, our quality control supervisor, stared down at her hands, the same hands that had been exposed to chemical spills twice this month, because proper protective equipment was apparently too expensive. Now I know some of you watching might think I'm being too harsh, Geneva said, now speaking directly to her future TikTok audience, but when you're trying to build something special, you can't let negativity drag you down. Success requires sacrifice, and some people just aren't willing to make it. Sacrifice. That was rich coming from someone who worked in a climate-controlled office while we sweltered in 100-degree heat because the ventilation system was functioning adequately according to her cost-cutting consultant. Geneva ended her little performance with a practiced smile and a motivational #salad, #boss life, #work ethic, #teamwork, #manufacturing excellence, #success mindset. The phone clicked off, and she looked around the room with satisfaction, as if she'd just delivered an inspiring speech instead of publicly humiliating her entire workforce. All right, everyone, break's over, back to work, she announced cheerfully, completely oblivious to the tension she'd just created. Remember, we've got that big order due Friday, so let's show some of that good old-fashioned work ethic. As Geneva clicked out of the break room in her pristine heels, the only person in the building not required to wear steel-toed boots, I calmly finished my sandwich. Around me my coworkers grumbled and shuffled back to their stations, another day of humiliation absorbed and internalized. But I didn't move yet. I sat there, methodically chewing, thinking about the folder hidden in my car. The folder containing 6 months of meticulous documentation. The folder that Geneva didn't know about, along with the phone number I'd memorized weeks ago, the direct line to the regional OSHA office. I pulled out my own phone, not to make a TikTok, but to open my notes app. Day 127, I typed quietly, subject public humiliation via social media. Boss filmed TikTok calling employees lazy while standing in front of blocked emergency exit. Ventilation system still non-functional. Chemical spill cleanup from Tuesday still incomplete. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then took a quick photo of the blocked emergency exit visible through the window. Evidence shot number 312. I'd lost count of how many safety violations I'd documented, but my phone's camera roll told the story. Hundreds of photos, each one time-stamped and geotagged. Tyler walked past my table, shaking his head. "Can you believe that?" he muttered under his breath. I just nodded sympathetically, but inside I was calculating. Geneva's TikTok would probably go live tonight. She'd probably get a few thousand views from her network of equally delusional small business owners. She'd feel validated, empowered, ready to double down on her tough love management style. What Geneva didn't realize was that her little performance had just given me something I'd been waiting for, a public admission that she was aware of our complaints, but chose to dismiss them as laziness, rather than address them as legitimate safety concerns. In legal terms, it was called willful negligence. I stood up slowly, collecting my things with the same calm demeanor I'd maintained through 6 months of documented abuse. Around me, the familiar sounds of the factory resumed. The whir of machinery, the hiss of compressed air, the mechanical grinding that had become the soundtrack of our daily survival. As I walked back to my station, passing the chemical storage area with its improperly labeled containers and inadequate ventilation, I smiled quietly. Geneva thought her TikTok would go viral for showing how tough and no-nonsense she was. She was right about it going viral. She was just wrong about the reason. Let me tell you who I really am, because Geneva's little TikTok certainly didn't capture the full picture. My name is Astrid Finch, and I've been working in manufacturing for 8 years. Not as some entry-level assembly worker, though there's nothing wrong with that. I started there too. I'm a certified safety inspector with a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering from Brookstone University, plus advanced certifications in OSHA compliance, hazardous materials handling, and workplace safety management. When I was hired at Pinnacle Manufacturing 18 months ago, I wasn't desperate for any job. I was specifically recruited by Geneva herself, who had seen my work improving safety protocols at Meridian Industries across town. She'd called me personally, gushing about how she needed someone with my expertise to take Pinnacle to the next level. Astrid, she'd said during my interview. Sitting in what I now knew was her carefully curated office with its fake motivational posters and unused hard hats displayed like trophies. "We need someone who understands that safety isn't just about following rules, it's about creating a culture of excellence." I'd been impressed, honestly. A female CEO in manufacturing was still relatively rare in our industrial district of Clearwater Heights, and Geneva seemed genuinely committed to building something special. She'd shown me the expansion plans, talked about her vision for Pinnacle becoming the premier custom manufacturing facility in the region. "I want to be the company that other companies look up to," she'd told me, her eyes bright with what seemed like authentic passion. "The place where people are proud to work, where safety and quality go hand in hand." She offered me a salary that was 15% higher than my previous job, plus a title that actually meant something: Director of Safety and Compliance. Not Safety Coordinator, or Safety Assistant, Director. With real authority to implement changes and shut down operations if I deemed them unsafe. Or so I thought. What I didn't realize during those early honeymoon weeks was that Geneva's idea of safety culture was more about the appearance of safety than actual safety. She loved the monthly safety meetings where she could stand at the front of the conference room with her perfectly pressed blazer and talk about our commitment to excellence. She loved the safety awards we could submit for, the certifications we could hang on the wall, the insurance discounts we could negotiate. What she didn't love was spending money on actual safety improvements. The reality of working at Pinnacle Manufacturing was a far cry from Geneva's glossy presentation. We were housed in a sprawling 85,000 square foot facility that had been built in the 1970s and hadn't seen a major renovation since the Clinton administration. The building was a maze of interconnected workshops, storage areas, and production floors, each one presenting its own unique safety challenges. Our primary business was custom metal fabrication and industrial component manufacturing. We made everything from specialized brackets for construction projects to precision components for automotive manufacturers. It was demanding work that required skilled operators, expensive machinery, and most importantly, strict adherence to safety protocols. The equipment alone represented millions of dollars in investments: industrial plasma cutters, hydraulic presses, welding stations, chemical treatment baths, overhead cranes, and computer-controlled milling machines. Each piece of machinery came with its own safety requirements, maintenance schedules, and operational protocols. When properly maintained and operated, they were relatively safe. When corners were cut, they became death traps. Our workforce consisted of 47 full-time employees, ranging from recent technical school graduates to veteran machinists with 30 years of experience. These weren't lazy employees looking for excuses to complain. They were skilled professionals who took pride in their work and wanted to go home to their families in one piece every night. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tyler Thorne, the machinist Geneva had unknowingly featured in her TikTok background, was a perfect example. He'd been working in manufacturing for 12 years, had never missed a deadline, and consistently produced some of the highest quality work in our shop. He also happened to be supporting his wife and 2 teenagers on his pinnacle salary. When Tyler raised concerns about equipment safety, it wasn't because he was lazy, it was because he was professional enough to recognize dangerous conditions. Joanne Hayes, our quality control supervisor, had a master's degree in materials science and 15 years of experience in manufacturing quality systems. When she documented problems with our chemical handling procedures, it wasn't because she was looking for excuses to avoid work, it was because she understood the science behind what could go wrong. The stakes at Pinnacle weren't just about inconvenience or inefficiency. We were dealing with industrial machinery, capable of crushing limbs, chemical processes that could cause permanent respiratory damage, electrical systems that could electrocute, and heat treatment operations that could cause severe burns. A single serious accident wouldn't just destroy the victim's life, it could shut down the entire operation and end all 47 careers at once. OSHA violations in a facility like ours typically resulted in fines, ranging from thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the severity and willfulness of the violations. But more importantly, they resulted in shutdowns, investigations, and the kind of publicity that could end a manufacturing business permanently. Geneva seemed to think that my job was to create the appearance of safety compliance, while finding ways to avoid the associated costs. She wanted me to write policies that looked good on paper, but wouldn't require expensive implementations. She wanted safety meetings that made everyone feel good, but didn't address actual hazards. She wanted certifications and awards that she could use for marketing purposes. What she got instead was someone who actually understood what those certifications meant, someone who took the director part of my title seriously, and someone who had sworn an oath when I received my safety certifications to prioritize worker protection above all else. The irony was that Geneva had hired exactly the right person for the job she claimed she wanted. I had the expertise to identify problems, the experience to implement solutions, and the certifications to ensure legal compliance. I could have made Pinnacle Manufacturing the model facility she claimed to envision. The problem was that she didn't actually want that job done. She wanted the appearance of having it done, which was a very different thing. As I stood at my workstation that afternoon, listening to the concerning rattle in the ventilation system that had been scheduled for evaluation for 3 months, I reflected on how dramatically different my current situation was from what I'd been promised during my interview. Instead of being the director of safety and compliance, I'd become the director of documenting Geneva's willful negligence. And I was very, very good at my actual job. 18 months ago, Geneva Vance seemed like everything I'd hoped to find in a manufacturing leader. Our first meeting wasn't even a formal interview. It was at the Clearwater Heights Business Development Breakfast, a monthly networking event where local industry leaders gathered to discuss economic development and partnership opportunities. I'd been representing Meridian Industries, where I'd just finished implementing a comprehensive safety overhaul that had reduced their incident rate by 73% and earned them a regional OSHA Voluntary Protection Program award. Geneva approached me during the coffee break, introducing herself with the kind of confidence that instantly commanded attention. "You're Astrid Finch, right? The safety director who transformed Meridian's entire operation." She extended a firm handshake and a genuine smile. "I'm Geneva Vance from Pinnacle Manufacturing. I've been hearing incredible things about your work." She wasn't wrong to be interested. The Meridian project had been my career-defining achievement up to that point. When I'd started there, they were averaging 2 recordable injuries per month and facing potential OSHA citations that could have cost them millions. 18 months later, they hadn't had a single lost time incident. Their workers' compensation premiums had dropped by 40%, and productivity had actually increased, due to improved equipment reliability and worker confidence. I'll be honest with you, Geneva had continued, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. I need someone with your expertise. Pinnacle is growing fast, maybe too fast, and I want to make sure we're building the right foundation from the beginning. That phrase, building the right foundation, should have been my first clue about Geneva's true priorities. She talked about foundations, but what she really meant was facades. Over the next hour, Geneva painted a picture of Pinnacle manufacturing that was genuinely exciting. She'd inherited the company from her uncle 3 years earlier, and under her leadership, they'd doubled their client base and expanded into new markets. The financial growth was impressive, but Geneva claimed she wasn't satisfied with just making money. Anyone can run a profitable manufacturing operation if they're willing to cut corners, she'd told me, her eyes bright with what seemed like genuine passion. I want to prove that you can be successful and ethical at the same time. I want Pinnacle to be the company that other companies look up to. She'd shown me photos on her phone of the facility's recent expansions, new equipment installations, and even preliminary architectural drawings for a planned training center. I want to create a workplace where people are excited to come to work every day, she'd said, where they feel valued, protected, and proud of what they're building. The numbers she quoted were impressive too. Geneva was offering a 30% salary increase over my current position, plus equity participation, and a benefits package that included continued education funding. More importantly, she was offering genuine authority, the kind of role where I could implement real changes, instead of just writing reports that got filed away. I want you to be my partner in this vision, she'd said, as our conversation wound down. Not just an employee, but a true collaborator in building something special. The formal interview process a week later only reinforced my positive impression. Geneva had clearly done her homework, asking specific questions about my methodologies, my experience with different types of manufacturing operations, and my philosophy about balancing safety requirements with operational efficiency. She'd given me a comprehensive tour of the Pinnacle facility, pointing out areas where she knew improvements were needed, and asking for my preliminary assessment. Don't sugarcoat anything, she'd insisted. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with if we're going to fix it properly. That tour should have been my second warning sign. Geneva talked confidently about problems that needed to be addressed, but she also had a ready excuse for why each issue hadn't been resolved yet. The ventilation system was scheduled for upgrade next quarter. The emergency exits were temporarily blocked due to the inventory surge. The chemical storage area was awaiting the new containment system installation. Everything was always just about to be fixed, just waiting for the right moment, just pending some other priority. But at the time I interpreted Geneva's awareness of these issues as a positive sign. She wasn't trying to hide problems or pretend they didn't exist. She was acknowledging them and expressing genuine commitment to addressing them systematically. I know it's not perfect yet, she'd admitted as we stood in the main production area, watching Tyler Thorne work around a safety guard that had been removed from his machine for maintenance and never replaced. But that's exactly why I need someone like you. Someone who won't let me make excuses, or put off what needs to be done. The clinching moment came when Geneva introduced me to some of the longtime employees during that initial tour. Their reactions were telling, not the eye-rolling or subtle negativity you'd expect if they thought safety initiatives were just corporate theater, but genuine enthusiasm about the possibility of improvements. We've been waiting for someone like you. Joanne Hayes had told me quietly during a brief moment, when Geneva was distracted by a phone call. Someone who actually understands what needs to happen here. Even Kelvin Shaw, the gruff production supervisor, who'd been at Pinnacle for over a decade, had seemed optimistic. Geneva talks a good game about safety, he'd said, but she needs someone who knows how to turn talk into action. My acceptance of Geneva's offer felt like the natural next step in my career progression. After years of working in established companies where safety protocols were already entrenched, I was excited about the opportunity to build something from the ground up. I was 31 years old, professionally accomplished, and ready to take on the challenge of creating a model safety culture in a growing manufacturing operation. Geneva seemed equally excited about our partnership. During my first week on the job, she'd introduced me to clients, suppliers, and business partners as our new director of safety and compliance, the person who's going to help us set the standard for excellence in our industry. She'd given me a generous budget for initial assessments and planning, encouraged me to attend conferences and training sessions to stay current with best practices, and even suggested that we co-author articles about safety leadership for industry publications. "I want people to know that Pinnacle Manufacturing takes safety seriously," she'd said during one of our early planning meetings. "I want our commitment to worker protection to be part of our brand identity." For the first 3 months, Geneva seemed like the ideal business partner. She approved my requests for safety equipment assessments, signed off on training program proposals, and even attended the safety meetings I organized. When I presented her with my comprehensive facility assessment, a 40-page document detailing current conditions and recommended improvements, she'd thanked me profusely and promised to review it carefully. The problem started when those recommendations began requiring actual expenditures. But during those early honeymoon weeks, I genuinely believed I'd found a leader who shared my values and would support my work. Geneva Vance seemed like someone who understood that true success meant creating value for everyone, workers, clients, and stakeholders alike. Looking back now, I realize that Geneva was exactly who she appeared to be during those early interactions. The problem wasn't that she'd misrepresented herself, it was that I'd misunderstood what she actually valued. She did want Pinnacle to be the company that other companies look up to, but only in terms of profitability and growth, not in terms of worker protection or ethical practices. She did want to build something special, but her definition of special was very different from mine. The tragedy was that we actually could have been great partners if Geneva had been willing to make the investments necessary to match her rhetoric with reality. I had the expertise and the passion to help her build exactly the kind of operation she claimed to want. Instead, I became the inconvenient reminder of the gap between Geneva's aspirations and her actual priorities. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Geneva was too sophisticated for that. Instead, it was a gradual erosion of authority, respect, and support that took place over months of small disappointments and broken promises. The first red flag appeared during month 4, when I submitted my prioritized list of safety improvements based on my comprehensive facility assessment. I'd organized the recommendations into 3 categories: critical immediate safety hazards, requiring urgent attention, important significant risks that should be addressed within 60 days, and recommended improvements that would enhance overall safety culture and efficiency. Geneva had scheduled a meeting to review my proposals, and I'd arrived prepared with detailed cost estimates, implementation timelines, and ROI calculations, showing how the improvements would reduce insurance costs, minimize downtime, and improve productivity. I'd even researched grant opportunities and financing options to help offset the initial investments. "This is really thorough work, Astrid," Geneva had said, flipping through my presentation materials with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this." But then came the pivot that would define our entire working relationship going forward. "The only thing is," she'd continued, her tone shifting subtly, "I'm wondering if we might be trying to do too much too fast. The budget you've outlined here, it's substantial. I'm concerned about the impact on our cash flow, especially with the Henderson Industries contract still pending." The Henderson Industries contract was Geneva's favorite excuse. It was a potential multi-million-dollar deal that had been almost finalized for the entire time I'd worked at Pinnacle. According to Geneva, we couldn't make any significant expenditures until Henderson was locked in, because we needed to maintain our financial flexibility for the expansion that contract would require. "I understand the budget concerns," I'd replied, "but the critical items on this list aren't optional. The ventilation system in the chemical treatment area is actively creating health hazards for our workers. The blocked emergency exits are OSHA violations that could result in citations and fines. These aren't improvements, they're requirements." Geneva had nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering my points. "You're absolutely right about the importance of these issues. Let me ask you this: what if we tackle them in phases? Start with the most critical items, and work our way down the list as budget allows." It seemed like a reasonable compromise. I'd agreed to prioritize the 5 most critical safety hazards, and defer the other improvements until the next quarter. Geneva had approved 3 of the 5 items, postponed 1 pending further evaluation, and suggested an alternative approach for the 5th that would achieve the same safety outcome at a lower cost. That pattern, approve some requests, postpone others, and suggest cheaper alternatives, became Geneva's standard response to every safety initiative I proposed over the next 8 months. The ventilation system in the chemical treatment area was a perfect example. I'd identified it as a critical hazard because the current system was inadequate to handle the fumes from our increased production volume.
Workers were experiencing headaches, respiratory irritation, and other symptoms of chemical exposure. The solution was straightforward: upgrade the ventilation system to handle our current capacity and install monitoring equipment to ensure proper air quality. Geneva's response was to approve the purchase of additional personal protective equipment instead. This way we can protect our workers immediately, while we evaluate long-term ventilation solutions, she'd explained. It's more cost-effective, and gives us time to research the best systems. The PPE was better than nothing, but it was treating a symptom, rather than addressing the root cause. Workers still had to endure poor air quality for 8 to 12 hours per day, and the inadequate ventilation continued to violate OSHA standards for workplace air quality. When I'd pointed this out, Geneva had become defensive. Astrid, I appreciate your expertise, but I also need you to understand the business realities we're dealing with. We can't solve every problem with expensive equipment purchases. Sometimes we need to be creative about finding solutions that work within our constraints. The emergency exit situation followed a similar pattern. I'd identified 3 exits that were blocked by inventory, equipment, or storage materials. Clear OSHA violations that could result in serious fines, and more importantly, could trap workers in case of fire or other emergencies. Geneva's initial response had been positive. You're absolutely right. We need to clear those exits immediately. But when I'd followed up 2 weeks later, the exits were still blocked. Geneva's explanation was that they were working on reorganizing the inventory storage system to create space elsewhere, but that it was more complicated than expected because of the ongoing Henderson Industries negotiations. We might need to reconfigure our entire layout, depending on what Henderson requires, she'd said. I don't want to move everything twice. Meanwhile, workers continued to navigate around blocked exits every day, and I continued to document the ongoing violations, while feeling increasingly frustrated by my inability to implement basic safety requirements. The pattern extended beyond specific safety improvements to my role within the organization itself. During my first few months, Geneva had included me in management meetings, introduced me to clients as a key member of the leadership team, and sought my input on operational decisions that might impact worker safety. But gradually I found myself excluded from important conversations. Management meetings became executive-only affairs, where safety topics were discussed without my input. Client visits happened without advance notice, so I couldn't participate in facility tours or safety discussions. Operational changes were implemented first, and I was informed afterward, often only when workers raised safety concerns about the new procedures.
The most telling incident occurred during month 6, when Geneva hired a productivity consultant named Elora Sterling to evaluate our operational efficiency. Elora was a recent MBA graduate with no manufacturing experience who specialized in lean operations and cost optimization. Geneva introduced Elora to the management team with great fanfare, describing her as someone who would help us streamline our processes and eliminate inefficiencies. What became clear over the following weeks was that Elora viewed safety protocols as inefficiencies to be eliminated rather than requirements to be maintained. Elora's recommendations included reducing the time allotted for safety briefings. Without 5 minutes should be sufficient for experienced workers, combining safety training with production training, a multitasking approach to maximize efficiency, and eliminating what she called redundant safety checks. But workers are properly trained, additional inspections are unnecessary. When I'd objected to these recommendations during a management meeting, pointing out that they would violate OSHA training requirements and create serious liability issues, Geneva had smiled patronizingly and said, "Astrid, I appreciate your attention to detail, but we also need to consider the bigger picture." Elora brings a fresh perspective that might help us find more efficient ways to maintain safety while improving productivity. The subtext was clear: my expertise was becoming inconvenient, and Geneva was looking for alternative perspectives that would support her cost-cutting priorities. The systematic undermining of my authority became more blatant as the months progressed. Maintenance requests I'd submitted would be approved by Geneva, but then delayed or modified by other managers without my knowledge. Safety policies I'd developed would be quietly revised to reduce requirements or create loopholes. Training programs I'd designed would be shortened or combined with other activities to minimize their impact on production time. Most frustratingly, Geneva began presenting my work as collaborative efforts rather than acknowledging my individual expertise. The safety manual I'd written became our new comprehensive safety program. The training protocols I'd developed were described as team-developed best practices. The incident reporting system I'd implemented was credited to leadership initiative rather than my specific design and implementation. When industry publications or potential clients asked about Pinnacle's safety programs, Geneva positioned herself as the visionary leader who had prioritized worker protection, while I became the talented safety professional who helps us implement our vision. The final straw in terms of professional undermining came during month 8, when Geneva announced that she was restructuring the safety department to better integrate with operations. My title remained the same, but my reporting structure changed so that I now had to get approval from Kelvin Shaw, the production supervisor, before implementing any safety-related changes. This will help ensure that safety initiatives are practical and operationally feasible, Geneva had explained during the announcement. Kelvin has decades of manufacturing experience, and his input will be valuable for making sure our safety programs work in the real world. What this meant in practice was that every safety improvement I proposed now had to be approved by someone whose primary concern was maintaining production schedules and minimizing costs. Kelvin wasn't malicious, but he was under constant pressure from Geneva to maximize output and minimize disruptions. Safety improvements inevitably created short-term disruptions, even when they improved long-term efficiency and productivity. By month 10, I'd effectively been demoted from Director of Safety and Compliance to Safety Advisor, with limited authority to implement changes and constant oversight from people whose priorities were fundamentally different from mine. But Geneva's most damaging betrayal wasn't professional, it was personal. During our early working relationship, she'd cultivated a mentorship dynamic, regularly asking for my career advice and sharing her own experiences as a woman in manufacturing leadership. She'd talked about the importance of supporting other women in the industry, and had even suggested that we co-present at conferences about female leadership in manufacturing. As our working relationship deteriorated, Geneva began using that personal connection against me. When I'd raise safety concerns in management meetings, she'd frame my advocacy as emotional rather than professional. Astrid is really passionate about worker protection, she'd say with a slight smile, sometimes to the point where it's hard for her to see the broader business perspective. When I'd insist on implementing mandatory safety requirements, Geneva would suggest that I was being inflexible or academic rather than practical. Astrid has excellent technical knowledge, she'd tell other managers, but she's still learning about the realities of running a business. The most infuriating part was that Geneva would deliver these undermining comments with a tone of affection and support, as if she was defending me rather than diminishing my credibility. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation that left me feeling simultaneously angry and powerless. By the time Geneva filmed her TikTok about lazy employees, I'd been systematically stripped of authority, excluded from decision-making, and publicly diminished for 18 months. But I'd also been documenting everything, building a comprehensive record of willful safety violations and deliberate indifference to worker protection. Geneva thought she'd neutralized me as a threat to her cost-cutting priorities. What she'd actually done was create the perfect witness to her own negligence. The morning of Geneva's TikTok performance started like any other day at Pinnacle Manufacturing, which is to say it started with crisis management and improvised solutions to problems that should have been fixed months earlier. I arrived at 6:30 a.m. to find Tyler Thorne and two other machinists standing around the main hydraulic press, which had developed an ominous grinding sound overnight. The safety interlock system, the mechanism designed to prevent the press from operating when someone's hands were in the danger zone, was malfunctioning intermittently. It's been cutting in and out since we started the morning shift, Tyler explained, demonstrating the problem by manually triggering the safety sensor. Sometimes it worked correctly, stopping the press immediately. Sometimes there was a dangerous delay, sometimes it didn't respond at all. This wasn't a minor inconvenience or a theoretical safety concern. The hydraulic press exerted over 50 tons of force and could easily crush bones, sever limbs, or kill someone instantly if the safety systems failed at the wrong moment. OSHA regulations were crystal clear: any machinery with malfunctioning safety systems had to be immediately shut down until repairs were completed. I made the call that should have been routine: shut it down and tag it out. Nobody operates this equipment until we get a certified technician to repair the interlock system. Tyler nodded gratefully, he'd been hoping I'd make that exact decision, and began implementing the lockouts tagout procedure that would prevent anyone from accidentally starting the machine while it was being serviced. That's when Kelvin Shaw appeared, coffee in hand and clearly irritated about something. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking at the tagged out equipment. "We've got the Morrison Industries order due this afternoon, we can't afford downtime on the main press." I explained the safety interlock problem and my decision to shut down the equipment until proper repairs could be completed. Kelvin's response was immediate and predictable. Can't we just run it manually? Tyler's been operating that press for 5 years. He knows how to keep his hands clear. Absolutely not, I replied firmly. Manual operation bypasses every safety system we have in place. If something goes wrong, Tyler could be killed. That's not an acceptable risk. Kelvin's frustration was obvious, but he knew better than to directly contradict safety protocols in front of other workers. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called Geneva. Geneva, it's Kelvin. We've got a situation with the main press. Astrid shut it down for some kind of safety sensor issue, but we've got Morrison due this afternoon. He walked away to continue the conversation privately, but I could hear enough to know where this was heading. 20 minutes later, Geneva arrived on the production floor, striding purposefully toward our small group, gathered around the tagged-out press. She was dressed in her usual management costume, a spotless white hard hat that had never seen actual work, safety glasses that she wore like a fashion accessory, and steel-toed boots that looked like they'd been polished that morning. "Good morning, everyone," she said with forced cheerfulness. "I understand we're having some equipment issues. Astrid, can you walk me through what's happening?" I explained the safety interlock malfunction again, emphasizing the serious injury risk and the OSHA requirements for immediate shutdown. Geneva nodded along with apparent understanding, asking technical questions about the specific failure mode and the repair timeline. "I appreciate your attention to safety," she said when I finished my explanation. "That's exactly why we hired someone with your expertise. But I'm wondering if there might be an interim solution that would allow us to continue production while we're waiting for the repair technician." Here it came. The part where Geneva would pressure me to compromise safety requirements in the name of production deadlines. "We could implement additional manual safety procedures," she continued. "Extra spotters, slower operation speeds, mandatory safety briefings before each shift. Would something like that be acceptable from a safety standpoint?" "No," I said clearly. "Malfunctioning safety systems can't be compensated for with manual procedures. The whole point of interlocking systems is that they're faster and more reliable than human reactions. If the sensor fails while someone's hand is in the press, no amount of manual oversight will prevent a serious injury." Geneva's smile became slightly strained. "I understand your position, Astrid, but I also need you to understand our business obligations. Morrison Industries is one of our biggest clients. If we miss this deadline, it could jeopardize our entire relationship with them." She was asking me to choose between worker safety and client relationships. In my world, that wasn't a choice at all. "Then we need to explain the situation to Morrison and negotiate a new deadline," I replied. "I'm sure they'll understand that equipment safety can't be compromised." Geneva's expression shifted subtly, from professional disagreement to something colder. "Astrid, I need you to think about the bigger picture here. We're not just talking about one order. We're talking about Pinnacle's reputation, our workers' job security, our ability to continue growing and investing in better equipment." It was the same argument she'd used dozens of times over the past year, worker safety versus business success, as if the two were mutually exclusive rather than fundamentally connected. "Geneva," I said, trying to maintain a professional tone despite my growing frustration, "compromising safety to meet deadlines is how people get killed. And when people get killed, OSHA shuts down the entire operation. Morrison Industries won't care about their order if we're facing criminal negligence charges." For a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to her. Geneva stood quietly, looking at the tagged-out press, as if seriously considering my argument. Then she turned to Kelvin and said, "What's your assessment of the risk level? In your experience, could we safely run a few pieces manually while we're waiting for the technician?" Kelvin glanced at me nervously, clearly uncomfortable about being asked to contradict my safety decision. "Well," he said slowly, "Tyler is our most experienced operator. If anyone could do it safely, it would be him." Geneva nodded, as if Kelvin had just provided definitive expert analysis. "Tyler, what's your comfort level with manual operation? I'm not asking you to do anything that feels unsafe, but I trust your judgment about what's manageable." This was the manipulation tactic Geneva had perfected over the past year, undermining my authority by appealing directly to workers' opinions about their own safety. It put Tyler in an impossible position. If he said yes, he'd be contradicting the safety expert and taking unnecessary risks. If he said no, he'd be disappointing his boss and potentially costing the company a major client. Tyler looked back and forth between Geneva and me, clearly torn. "I mean, I could probably handle a few pieces manually," he said reluctantly, "as long as we take it slow and use extra precautions." "There we go," Geneva said with satisfaction. "Teamwork and creative problem solving, that's how we overcome challenges." "No," I said firmly. I'm the Director of Safety and Compliance, and I'm telling you that this equipment cannot be operated with malfunctioning safety systems. That's not a suggestion or a recommendation, it's a mandatory safety requirement. Geneva's mask finally slipped completely. Her professional smile disappeared, and for the first time, I saw genuine anger in her expression. Astrid, she said in a voice that was carefully controlled but unmistakably hostile. I appreciate your commitment to following protocols, but I also need you to understand that you're not the only person here with decision-making authority. This is a business, not a safety seminar. The production floor had gone quiet around us. Workers at nearby stations had stopped what they were doing, and were listening to our confrontation with obvious discomfort. Everyone knew this conversation would determine whether safety requirements meant anything at Pinnacle Manufacturing. If you override my safety decision, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, I'll be documenting this incident and reporting it to OSHA as willful negligence. Is that really the position you want to take? Geneva's eyes flashed with something between surprise and fury. I don't think she'd expected me to escalate the conflict so publicly, or to invoke OSHA directly. Are you threatening me? She asked incredulously. I'm informing you of my professional obligations, I replied. When safety requirements are knowingly violated, I'm legally required to document and report those violations. That's not a threat, it's my job. For several seconds, Geneva stared at me with undisguised hostility. Around us, the production floor remained eerily quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve. Finally, Geneva turned to address the gathered workers with forced cheerfulness. Well, it looks like we're going to have some equipment downtime today. That's unfortunate, but safety always comes first at Pinnacle Manufacturing. She walked away without another word to me, but I could see the anger in her posture and the determination in her stride. I'd won this particular battle, but I'd also declared war. That afternoon, while the press sat idle waiting for a repair technician who wouldn't arrive until the next morning, Geneva called an impromptu management meeting. I wasn't invited. 2 hours later, Kelvin approached me with obvious discomfort. Geneva wants to see you in her office, he said. She seemed upset. I found Geneva sitting behind her desk with a stack of papers and an expression of cold professionalism. Close the door and have a seat, she said without looking up. Astrid, she began once I was seated, we need to discuss your role here at Pinnacle and whether it's still a good fit for both of us. Here it came, the conversation I'd been expecting for months. Your technical knowledge is excellent, Geneva continued, but I'm concerned about your ability to work collaboratively within our management structure. The incident this morning, with you essentially threatening to report the company to OSHA, suggests that you may not fully understand the cooperative approach we try to maintain here. I let her talk, documenting every word in my memory for the report I'd be writing that evening. I've been thinking that maybe we need to restructure your position, she said. Focus more on documentation and compliance paperwork, less on day-to-day operational decisions. That might be a better use of your particular strengths. Translation, she wanted to demote me to a desk job, where I couldn't interfere with her cost-cutting decisions. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. A consulting role, Geneva said with artificial enthusiasm. Part-time, project-based work. You'd maintain your expertise in safety regulations, but you wouldn't be involved in daily operational decisions. It would give you more flexibility, and us more operational autonomy. Another translation, she was firing me but trying to make it sound voluntary. And if I prefer to maintain my current role and responsibilities, I asked. Geneva's smile became predatory. Well, that would depend on whether you can demonstrate the kind of collaborative attitude that we value here. Today's incident suggests that might be challenging for you. The threat was clear, accept the demotion or be fired for attitude problems. I sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the folder in my car, containing 6 months of documented safety violations. The photos on my phone, showing dozens of OSHA non-compliance issues, and the detailed incident reports I'd been filing for everything from blocked emergency exits to chemical exposure incidents. I'll need some time to consider your proposal, I said finally. Of course, Geneva replied. Take the weekend to think about it. We can discuss your decision on Monday. As I walked back to my car that evening, passing the blocked emergency exit and the still broken ventilation system, I realized that Geneva had finally given me everything I needed. She demonstrated willful disregard for safety requirements, attempted to coerce me into violating OSHA regulations, and threatened my employment for enforcing mandatory safety protocols. I spent that weekend organizing my documentation and preparing for the war that Geneva didn't realize she'd already declared. Monday morning, she filmed her TikTok about lazy employees and sealed her own fate.
While Geneva spent 18 months systematically undermining my authority and cutting safety corners, I spent those same 18 months building the most comprehensive documentation of workplace safety violations that OSHA Region VID had ever received from a single source. It started on my third day at Pinnacle Manufacturing. During my initial facility assessment, I'd been hired to evaluate current conditions and recommend improvements, which meant I had legitimate business reasons to photograph, measure, and document every aspect of the operation. Geneva had even encouraged me to be thorough and detail-oriented in my assessment. What Geneva didn't realize was that my definition of thorough was somewhat more extensive than she'd anticipated. Every morning, I arrived at Pinnacle 30 minutes before my official start time. I used those 30 minutes to conduct what I called my daily safety audit, a systematic review of conditions throughout the facility. I developed a standardized checklist covering everything from emergency exits and ventilation systems to chemical storage and equipment maintenance status. But this wasn't just a casual walkthrough with a clipboard. I treated each daily audit like a forensic investigation, using professional documentation techniques I'd learned during my certification training and refined through years of experience. Every potential violation was photographed from multiple angles, with careful attention to lighting and composition that would clearly show the problem to someone who'd never seen the facility. I used a high-quality camera with timestamp and GPS functionality, ensuring that every image contained metadata proving exactly when and where it was taken. More importantly, I photographed the same areas repeatedly over time, creating a visual timeline that showed how problems persisted or worsened, despite my written reports and verbal warnings. The blocked emergency exit in the main production area, for example, was documented in 127 different photographs over 6 months, showing not only that the exit remained blocked, but that the blocking materials changed regularly, proving that this wasn't an oversight but a deliberate decision to use the emergency exit area for storage. The ventilation system in the chemical treatment area was documented even more extensively. I'd used a borrowed air quality monitor to take regular measurements of chemical vapor concentrations, comparing them to OSHA permissible exposure limits and documenting the results in a detailed spreadsheet. When workers started reporting headaches and respiratory irritation, I documented those complaints as well, creating a clear connection between inadequate ventilation and worker health impacts. But photography was just one component of my documentation system. I'd also been maintaining detailed written records of every safety-related conversation, meeting and decision at Pinnacle Manufacturing. My computer contained a folder labeled Safety Compliance Documentation that included copies of every email I'd sent to Geneva regarding safety concerns, every written report I'd submitted, every meeting agenda and follow-up memo related to safety issues. More importantly, it included Geneva's responses to my concerns, the emails where she postponed necessary repairs, the memos where she rejected safety improvements for budgetary reasons, the meeting notes where she prioritized production deadlines over worker protection. I'd been particularly careful to document instances where Geneva had explicitly acknowledged safety hazards, but chosen not to address them. The email thread about the hydraulic press safety interlock system, for example, showed that Geneva had been aware of intermittent failures for over 2 months, but had repeatedly postponed repairs, because the equipment is still functional most of the time. The chemical storage area violations were documented in similar detail. I'd sent Geneva 3 separate reports detailing improper labeling, inadequate containment, and ventilation deficiencies. Her responses included phrases like "we'll address this when budget allows," and "this is a lower priority than our current initiatives." In OSHA terminology, this kind of documented awareness combined with deliberate inaction constituted willful violations, the most serious category of workplace safety violations, carrying the highest fines and potential criminal liability. But my documentation went beyond just recording violations. I'd also been researching the legal framework that would govern any potential OSHA investigation, familiarizing myself with enforcement procedures, penalty structures, and the specific regulations that applied to our type of manufacturing operation. I'd obtained copies of all relevant OSHA standards for our industry, highlighted the specific requirements that Pinnacle was violating, and cross-referenced those requirements with my photographic and written documentation. When the time came to file a complaint, I'd be able to cite specific regulatory sections, provide clear evidence of violations, and demonstrate the willful nature of Geneva's non-compliance. More importantly, I'd been building relationships within the regulatory community that would ensure my complaints received appropriate attention. During my previous position at Meridian Industries, I'd worked closely with OSHA compliance officers during their voluntary protection program evaluation. That experience had introduced me to Inspector Patricia Chen, a 20-year OSHA veteran who specialized in manufacturing safety and had a reputation for thorough professional investigations. Inspector Chen and I had maintained a professional relationship through industry conferences and training sessions. She knew my background, respected my expertise, and understood that I wouldn't file frivolous complaints or waste her time with minor concerns. 6 months into my employment at Pinnacle, I'd contacted Inspector Chen informally to discuss hypothetical compliance concerns and get her guidance on documentation requirements for potential future complaints. That conversation had helped me refine my documentation approach and ensure that I was gathering the kind of evidence that would support effective enforcement action. The key to a successful OSHA complaint, Inspector Chen had told me during our informal discussion, is demonstrating both the existence of hazards and the employer's knowledge of those hazards. If you can show that management was aware of specific problems and chose not to address them, that's when we can pursue willful violation charges. That conversation had shaped my entire documentation strategy. Instead of just recording safety problems, I'd focused on creating an undeniable record of Geneva's awareness and deliberate indifference. The most damning piece of evidence in my collection was a series of audio recordings I'd made during management meetings where safety issues were discussed. I'd used my phone's voice recording app to capture Geneva's exact words when she dismissed safety concerns, postponed necessary repairs, or prioritized production over worker protection. Audio recording in the workplace was legal in our state, as long as one party to the conversation consented, which I did, as a participant in the meetings. More importantly, the recordings captured Geneva's tone and attitude, providing context that written summaries couldn't convey. In one particularly damaging recording from 3 months earlier, Geneva could be heard saying, "Look, I understand that Astrid thinks we need to fix every little thing immediately, but we're running a business here, not a safety seminar. Sometimes workers need to adapt to reality instead of expecting us to spend money every time they have a concern." Another recording captured Geneva's response to my report about chemical exposure complaints. "These people worked in manufacturing before OSHA existed, and they survived just fine. A little discomfort builds character. We can't baby everyone who claims they don't feel perfect every single day." But the most incriminating recording was from last month's management meeting, where Geneva had explicitly discussed her strategy for managing safety complaints. The key is to acknowledge Astrid's concerns, so she feels heard, but then explain why immediate action isn't practical. She'll document everything anyway, but as long as we have business justifications for our decisions, we're protected. That recording alone would probably be sufficient to establish willful violation charges, but I'd collected dozens of similar statements over the course of my employment. Beyond documentation, I'd also been quietly building support within the workforce for potential OSHA action. This wasn't about organizing workers or encouraging complaints, it was about ensuring that honest workers would be willing to speak truthfully to investigators about the conditions they experienced daily. I'd had informal conversations with longtime employees like Tyler Thorne and Joanne Hayes, not to encourage them to complain, but to make sure they understood their rights under OSHA's whistleblower protection provisions. If OSHA investigators interviewed workers during an inspection, I wanted to ensure that people felt safe telling the truth about safety conditions without fear of retaliation. Tyler, in particular, had become an invaluable source of information about historical safety problems that predated my employment. He'd told me about equipment failures, near-miss incidents, and worker injuries that had never been properly documented or reported to OSHA as required by law. Geneva's always been more worried about how things look than how they actually are, Tyler had confided during one of our conversations. She'll spend money on new paint and company logos, but fixing the ventilation system is too expensive and not a priority. Joanne had provided similar insights about the chemical handling procedures and the systematic corner cutting that had become standard practice under Geneva's leadership. "She hired you because she thought having a safety director would make us look professional," Joanne had observed. "But she never intended to actually implement your recommendations."
By the time Geneva filmed her TikTok video, I had assembled what I believed to be the most comprehensive case for willful OSHA violations that Inspector Chen had ever received. My documentation included over 400 photographs showing safety violations, taken over 6 months with consistent timestamps and GPS coordinates, detailed written reports documenting every safety concern I'd raised, and Geneva's responses, audio recordings of management meetings where safety decisions were discussed, air quality measurements showing chemical exposure above OSHA limits, worker testimony about ongoing safety problems and health impacts, Email documentation showing Geneva's awareness and deliberate indifference, financial records proving that safety improvements were postponed for budgetary rather than technical reasons. But I'd been waiting for the right moment to file my complaint. A moment when Geneva's actions would be so egregious that even the business community would understand the necessity of OSHA intervention. Geneva's TikTok performance provided exactly that moment. When Geneva stood in front of those blocked emergency exits and called her workers lazy for complaining about safety conditions, she'd given me the final piece of evidence I needed: a public demonstration of her contempt for worker safety concerns. More importantly, she'd created a viral record of her attitude that would be impossible to deny or explain away during an OSHA investigation. That evening, I sat in my apartment organizing my documentation one final time. 6 months of careful preparation had led to this moment. Tomorrow Inspector Chen would receive the most thoroughly documented OSHA complaint of her career, supported by evidence that would make willful violation charges virtually unavoidable. Geneva thought her TikTok showed strong leadership and business savvy. What it actually showed was a manufacturing executive publicly mocking worker safety concerns while standing in front of obvious OSHA violations. She'd just handed OSHA everything they needed to shut down her operation and impose the maximum penalties allowed by law. I smiled as I typed the subject line for my email to Inspector Chen: formal OSHA complaint, willful safety violations at Pinnacle Manufacturing, the OSHA investigation requested. Geneva was about to learn that some employees don't just document problems, some of us know exactly what to do with the documentation. I sent my OSHA complaint at 11:47 p.m. that Monday night, exactly 3 hours after Geneva's TikTok went live. The timing wasn't coincidental. I wanted the viral video to be fully circulating before Inspector Chen opened my email the next morning. The subject line was deliberately professional: formal OSHA complaint, willful safety violations at Pinnacle Manufacturing, the OSHA investigation requested. But the attached documentation package was anything but routine. My complaint included 127 pages of written documentation, 400+ photographs organized by violation type and date, audio recordings totaling over 6 hours, air quality measurements spanning 4 months, and a detailed analysis connecting each observed violation to specific OSHA regulations. Most importantly, I'd included Geneva's TikTok video along with a transcript highlighting her dismissive comments about worker safety concerns. At 6:23 a.m. Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Inspector Chen: received your complaint. This is extremely serious. Emergency inspection authorized. Do not discuss with anyone at facility. Full team deploying this morning. I'd expected a thorough investigation eventually, but I hadn't anticipated an emergency inspection. Inspector Chen later explained that the combination of willful violations, documented worker endangerment, and viral social media evidence had triggered OSHA's expedited response protocol typically reserved for imminent danger situations. I arrived at Pinnacle that Tuesday morning at my usual time, maintaining my normal routine while internally preparing for what was about to unfold. The TikTok video had gained significant traction overnight, over 50,000 views and hundreds of comments, most of them critical of Geneva's attitude toward her workers. The comments section had become a brutal indictment of her leadership style. Imagine calling your employees lazy while standing in front of blocked emergency exits. This is why we need unions. No worker should be humiliated like this. Someone should report this company to OSHA. Those working conditions look dangerous. Boss lady thinks she's motivational, but she just looks like a nightmare manager. That last comment proved prophetic. At 9:15 a.m., I was at my workstation reviewing maintenance schedules when Tyler Thorne approached with wide eyes. Astrid, there are government vehicles in the parking lot. Multiple cars with official plates. Through the main floor windows I could see 3 dark sedans and a white van emblazoned with U.S. Department of Labor Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Inspector Chen had brought a full investigation team. The timing was perfect. Geneva was in her office preparing for a client presentation, completely unaware that her world was about to implode. The workers on the morning shift were going about their normal routines, navigating around the same safety hazards they'd been complaining about for months. At 9:22 a.m., Inspector Chen entered through the main entrance, followed by 3 other investigators and a documentation specialist. She was carrying an official OSHA inspection warrant and wearing the kind of serious expression that meant business. I watched from a distance as the receptionist, clearly flustered, called Geneva's office to announce the unexpected visitors. Geneva's response was audible from across the production floor. OSHA, what the hell do they want? Tell them I'll be right down. Geneva appeared 2 minutes later, still carrying her coffee mug and wearing the confused expression of someone who genuinely believed her operation was above reproach. She approached Inspector Chen with the same confident smile she'd used in her TikTok video. Good morning, I'm Geneva Vance, CEO of Pinnacle Manufacturing. To what do we owe the pleasure of this visit? Inspector Chen's response was professionally courteous but unmistakably serious. Miss Vance, I'm Inspector Patricia Chen with OSHA Region V. We're here to conduct a comprehensive safety inspection of your facility, based on a formal complaint alleging willful violations of federal workplace safety standards. The color drained from Geneva's face. A complaint? From whom? About what? I can't discuss the source of complaints during an active investigation, Inspector Chen replied. But I can tell you that we have documentation of multiple serious violations, including blocked emergency exits, inadequate ventilation systems, malfunctioning safety equipment, and improper chemical storage practices. Geneva's eyes darted around the production floor, suddenly seeing her facility through the lens of regulatory scrutiny rather than cost optimization. For the first time in 18 months, she was looking at the blocked emergency exits, the flickering ventilation system, and the chemical storage area as potential problems rather than acceptable cost-saving measures. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding, Geneva said, her voice taking on the slightly higher pitch that indicated rising panic. We have a certified safety director on staff. Astrid Finch, she's right over there, she's been handling all our compliance issues. Inspector Chen nodded calmly. Miss Finch's qualifications and documentation were noted in the complaint. Her professional observations form a significant part of our investigation. The irony was perfect. Geneva was pointing to me as evidence of her commitment to safety, not realizing that I was the source of the very complaint that was about to destroy her operation. We'll need to interview all management personnel and conduct a complete facility inspection. Inspector Chen continued. This investigation will take several days, and will need full cooperation from your staff. Geneva's panic was becoming more obvious by the minute. Several days, we have production deadlines, client commitments, can't we schedule this for a more convenient time? OSHA investigations take priority over production schedules. Inspector Chen said firmly. Worker safety is not negotiable. That phrase, worker safety is not negotiable, seemed to hit Geneva like a physical blow. For 18 months, she'd been treating worker safety as entirely negotiable, balancing it against costs, deadlines, and convenience. Now she was facing someone who viewed safety as an absolute requirement. The inspection began immediately. Inspector Chen's team spread throughout the facility with clipboards, cameras, and measuring equipment, documenting every violation with the same methodical precision I'd been using for the past 6 months. Inspector Rodriguez headed to the chemical storage area and immediately identified improper labeling, inadequate ventilation, and missing secondary containment. His preliminary findings included 5 separate violations that could result in serious citations. Inspector Williams focused on the mechanical systems and quickly discovered the malfunctioning safety interlocks, inadequate machine guarding, and deferred maintenance issues that Geneva had been postponing for months. Inspector Thompson documented the blocked emergency exits, inadequate lighting, and facility layout problems that created evacuation hazards. But the most damaging discovery came when Inspector Chen herself examined the ventilation system in the main production area. Using professional air quality monitoring equipment, she immediately detected chemical vapor concentrations that exceeded OSHA permissible exposure limits by over 200%. Miss Vance, Inspector Chen called out, her voice carrying across the production floor, I need you to see this immediately. Geneva hurried over as Inspector Chen showed her the air quality readings on a digital monitor. These vapor concentrations are dangerous. How long have workers been exposed to these levels? Geneva stammered something about recent increases in production volume and planned ventilation upgrades, but Inspector Chen was already making notes about willful endangerment. I'm ordering an immediate work stoppage in this area until air quality can be brought into compliance. Inspector Chen announced. No workers should be exposed to these chemical levels. The work stoppage order sent a visible shock through Geneva's composure. Not only was she facing regulatory violations, but her production was being shut down in real time, costing thousands of dollars per hour. Can't we just provide additional protective equipment while we address the ventilation issue? Geneva asked desperately. Personal protective equipment is not a substitute for proper engineering controls. Inspector Chen replied, "This is exactly the kind of thinking that led to this investigation." As the morning progressed, the scope of violations became increasingly apparent. Inspector Chen's team was finding problems in every area of the facility, documenting violations that I'd been reporting for months but that Geneva had chosen to ignore or postpone. More importantly, they were finding evidence of the willful nature of these violations. Email printouts I'd provided showed Geneva's awareness of specific problems. Audio recordings captured her dismissive attitude towards safety concerns. The photographic timeline demonstrated that problems had persisted and worsened despite repeated warnings. By lunchtime, Geneva was in full crisis mode. She'd called her lawyer, contacted her insurance company, and was desperately trying to arrange emergency repairs for the most obvious violations. But Inspector Chen had made it clear that the investigation would proceed regardless of any last-minute fixes. Attempting to remedy violations during an inspection doesn't eliminate liability for the period when workers were endangered. Inspector Chen explained when Geneva asked about getting credit for rapid repairs. The afternoon brought even worse news for Geneva. Inspector Chen's team had discovered that several workplace injuries over the past year had not been properly reported to OSHA as required by law. Tyler's chemical burn, Joanne's respiratory symptoms, and 3 other incidents had all been treated as minor first aid cases rather than recordable injuries. Failure to maintain accurate injury records is a serious violation in itself. Inspector Chen informed Geneva during their afternoon briefing. It suggests a pattern of concealing safety problems rather than addressing them. Geneva's attempts at damage control were becoming increasingly frantic. She'd brought in an emergency cleaning crew to address chemical spills, called a contractor to unblock the emergency exits, and even ordered new safety equipment that should have been purchased months earlier. But none of these desperate measures could undo 18 months of documented negligence. The real devastation came when Inspector Chen reviewed Geneva's TikTok video as part of the official investigation record. In the OSHA conference room, with Geneva's lawyer present, Inspector Chen played the video and asked Geneva to explain her comments about lazy employees and their complaints. "Were you referring to safety concerns when you mentioned employee complaints?" Inspector Chen asked. Geneva's lawyer advised her not to answer, but the damage was already done. The video showed Geneva publicly dismissing worker concerns while standing in front of obvious safety violations. In legal terms, it was an admission of willful indifference to worker safety. By 4 p.m., Inspector Chen was ready to deliver her preliminary findings. Geneva, her lawyer, and several members of management gathered in the conference room as Inspector Chen outlined the scope of violations discovered during the day's investigation. "We have identified 23 separate OSHA violations, ranging from serious to willful categories," Inspector Chen began. "The willful violations alone carry potential penalties of up to $145,000 each." Geneva's face went white as Inspector Chen continued. "More concerning is the pattern of deliberate indifference to worker safety demonstrated by management. The documentation provided shows that these violations were known to management and deliberately left unaddressed for budgetary reasons." The lawyer was frantically taking notes, but Geneva seemed to be in shock. "We are also recommending criminal referral to the Department of Justice for willful endangerment of workers, based on the chemical exposure levels and the documented awareness of these hazards." Criminal referral, the words hung in the air like a death sentence for Geneva's business and personal reputation. "The facility will remain under partial work stoppage until critical violations are remedied," Inspector Chen concluded. "Full citations and penalties will be issued within 30 days following completion of our investigation." As the OSHA team prepared to leave that first day, Inspector Chen approached me privately. "Your documentation was exceptional," she said quietly. "This is exactly the kind of evidence we need to pursue willful violation charges. You may have saved lives by bringing this to our attention." I nodded professionally, but inside I was experiencing the satisfaction of 18 months of preparation finally bearing fruit. Geneva spent the rest of the afternoon on phone calls with lawyers, insurance companies, and damage control specialists. But the real damage was just beginning. By evening, local news stations had picked up the story.
OSHA shuts down local manufacturing plant after viral TikTok exposes safety violations was the lead story on 3 different channels. Geneva's TikTok video was playing on television news programs, followed by footage of OSHA investigators and work stoppage orders. The visual contrast between Geneva's confident dismissal of worker concerns and the serious federal investigation was devastating. Social media erupted with commentary about toxic boss culture and worker exploitation. Geneva's attempt to showcase her tough management style had instead become a viral example of exactly the kind of workplace behavior that federal regulators were cracking down on. The next morning brought even more devastating news. The story had been picked up by national outlets, and Geneva's face was appearing on business news programs as an example of how not to manage workplace safety. More importantly, other former employees were coming forward with additional complaints and documentation of safety problems that predated my employment. The OSHA investigation was expanding beyond my original complaint to include historical violations and a pattern of systematic safety neglect. Geneva's 18 months of treating me as an inconvenient obstacle to cost-cutting had created the perfect storm of regulatory, legal, and public relations disasters. But this was just the beginning. The full scope of consequences would unfold over the following weeks, as OSHA completed their investigation, and Geneva discovered the true cost of willful safety violations. Inspector Chen had been right, my documentation was exceptional. But more importantly, it was complete, undeniable, and legally devastating. Geneva had spent 18 months thinking she was managing a business. What she'd actually been doing was building the case for her own destruction, one willful violation at a time. 3 weeks after OSHA's emergency inspection, Geneva Vance's world had completely collapsed, but mine was just beginning to flourish in ways I'd never imagined possible. The final OSHA citations arrived on a Thursday morning, 27 violations totaling $2.3 million in fines, plus a criminal referral to the Department of Justice for willful endangerment. The local news coverage was brutal, but the national business media coverage was even worse. Geneva had become the poster child for everything wrong with modern workplace culture. Forbes published an article titled, "The $2.30 million TikTok, How One Video Destroyed a Manufacturing Company." Harvard Business Review used Geneva's case study in a piece about the true cost of cutting safety corners. Even the Wall Street Journal ran an editorial about executive accountability in the social media age. But while Geneva's reputation was being demolished in real time, something unexpected was happening to mine. The morning after the initial OSHA inspection, my phone had started ringing with calls from journalists, industry professionals, and other manufacturing companies. Everyone wanted to know about the safety expert who'd built such a comprehensive case against willful violations. The first call came from Jessica Chen, a reporter for Industrial Safety Weekly. "Ms. Finch, your documentation in the Pinnacle case is being called the gold standard for OSHA complaints. Would you be willing to discuss your methodology?" That interview led to a feature article about professional documentation techniques for safety violations. The article was shared thousands of times and established me as a thought leader in workplace safety advocacy. The second call came from Robert Sterling, the CEO of Meridian Industries, my former employer. "Astrid, I've been following the Pinnacle situation in the news. Would you consider returning to Meridian as our VP of Safety and Compliance? We're expanding operations and need someone with your expertise." The offer was tempting: a significant promotion, substantial salary increase, and the opportunity to implement safety programs across multiple facilities. But as flattering as it was, I realized I wanted something different. The third call changed everything. "Ms. Finch, this is Dr. Sarah Williams from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. We've been reviewing your work in the Pinnacle case, and we'd like to discuss a consulting opportunity with our Voluntary Protection Program division." NIOSH was the research arm of workplace safety, the organization that developed the standards and practices that OSHA enforced. Being approached by NIOSH was like being recruited by the major leagues of occupational safety. But even that prestigious opportunity didn't capture my imagination the way the fourth call did. "Astrid, my name is David Hayes, and I represent the Workers' Safety Defense Fund. We're a nonprofit organization that provides legal and technical support to workers facing unsafe conditions. After seeing your work on the Pinnacle case, we'd like to offer you a position as our Director of Technical Documentation." The Workers' Safety Defense Fund was exactly what it sounded like, an organization that helped workers document safety violations and navigate the OSHA complaint process. They provided free training, legal support, and technical assistance to workers who couldn't afford private safety consultants but needed professional help building their cases. We've seen too many situations where workers know they're in danger but don't know how to document it properly for regulatory action, David explained during our phone conversation. Your Pinnacle documentation showed workers across the country what's possible when someone has the right training and tools. That conversation planted the seed of an idea that would eventually reshape my entire career. But first I had to deal with the immediate aftermath of Geneva's collapse. Pinnacle manufacturing never reopened. The OSHA fines alone would have been devastating, but the criminal investigation and the avalanche of negative publicity made recovery impossible. Geneva spent the next month trying to sell the company's assets to pay legal fees and regulatory penalties. Most of Pinnacle's employees found new jobs relatively quickly. Tyler Thorne was hired by a precision machining company that offered better pay and actual safety equipment, while Joanne Hayes joined a pharmaceutical manufacturing operation that valued her quality control expertise. But several workers approached me with a request that was both humbling and inspiring. Astrid Tyler said during a coffee meeting 2 weeks after Pinnacle's closure, "Joanne and I have been talking with some of the other folks from the plant. We want to make sure this doesn't happen to other workers. Would you be willing to teach us how you documented everything? We want to know how to protect ourselves and our co-workers if we ever face something like this again." That conversation led to the first meeting of what became the Clearwater Heights Workers Safety Network, an informal group where I taught former Pinnacle employees how to identify safety violations, document problems properly, and navigate the OSHA complaint process. The monthly meetings started small, held in the community center with just 8 people. But word spread quickly through the local manufacturing community. Workers from other companies started attending, sharing their own safety concerns, and learning documentation techniques. Within 3 months, we had over 40 regular attendees representing 15 different companies. More importantly, we were getting results. Maria Santos, a worker from Apex Fabrication, used our training to document chemical exposure problems at her facility. Her properly prepared OSHA complaint resulted in immediate workplace improvements and no retaliation, because she'd followed our protocols for building an airtight case. James Park, a maintenance technician at Cumberland Industries, identified electrical safety violations and used our documentation methods to compel his employer to make necessary repairs before anyone was injured. Rosa Williams, a quality inspector at Brookfield Manufacturing, documented ergonomic hazards and helped her company implement workstation improvements that reduced injury rates by 60%. Each success story reinforced my growing conviction that worker education and empowerment was the key to preventing situations like Pinnacle from happening in the first place. 6 months after Geneva's TikTok destroyed her company, I made the decision that would define the next phase of my career. I turned down the prestigious NIOSH position, politely declined Meridian's VP offer, and instead accepted the role with the Workers' Safety Defense Fund. But I negotiated for something unusual: the flexibility to maintain my own consulting practice focused specifically on worker education and empowerment. The combination was perfect. Through WSDF, I could provide free training and support to workers who couldn't afford professional help. Through my private practice, I could work with progressive companies that wanted to implement truly effective safety cultures, rather than just compliance theater. My first major private client was Brookstone Manufacturing, a mid-sized operation that had seen the Pinnacle coverage and decided they wanted to ensure their safety programs were genuinely effective, rather than just paperwork exercises. "We don't want to be the next viral TikTok disaster," their CEO told me frankly. "We want to build something our workers are proud of and our competitors respect." Working with Brookstone was everything my experience at Pinnacle should have been. Management that listened to safety recommendations, workers who felt empowered to raise concerns, and a culture where safety improvements were viewed as investments rather than costs. Within a year, Brookstone had reduced their incident rate by 75%, decreased their insurance premiums by 40%, and earned recognition as one of the region's safest employers. More importantly, their workers reported feeling valued and protected rather than expendable. The success at Brookstone led to more consulting opportunities, but I was selective about clients. I only worked with companies that demonstrated genuine commitment to worker protection, rather than just regulatory compliance. My reputation in the industry grew rapidly. I was invited to speak at conferences, contribute to safety publications, and consult on regulatory policy development. The National Safety Council asked me to join their Manufacturing Safety Advisory Committee. OSHA invited me to participate in stakeholder meetings about enforcement priorities. But my most meaningful work remained the grassroots education and empowerment efforts. The Clearwater Heights Workers' Safety Network had grown into a regional organization, with over 200 active members representing 40 companies. We documented and resolved hundreds of safety issues, prevented countless injuries, and created a culture where workers felt empowered to advocate for their own protection. More importantly, our model was being replicated in other cities. Workers' safety networks were forming in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Phoenix, and a dozen other manufacturing centers. The documentation techniques and advocacy strategies we developed were spreading across the country. 1 year after Geneva's TikTok went viral, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my new office, a space I'd rented in downtown Clearwater Heights to house my consulting practice and coordinate the Workers' Safety Network, when my assistant announced that Geneva Vance was asking to see me. Geneva looked like a different person. Gone were the polished blazers and confident demeanor. She appeared tired, defeated, and genuinely humbled by the complete destruction of her professional reputation. "Astrid," she said quietly, "I know I don't have any right to ask for your time, but I was hoping we could talk." I gestured to a chair, curious about what had brought her to my office. "I wanted to apologize," Geneva continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not because my lawyer thinks it might help with the criminal case, but because I genuinely understand now how wrong I was." She paused, looking around my office with its safety awards, conference photos, and worker testimonials covering the walls. "I've been attending anger management counseling and business ethics classes as part of my plea agreement," she said. "One of the exercises was to research what happened to the people I'd wronged. When I saw what you'd built after Pinnacle, I realized I hadn't just been hurting workers. I'd been wasting your talents." I listened without comment as Geneva continued. "You tried to help me build something good," she said. "You had the expertise and the passion to make Pinnacle everything I claimed I wanted it to be. But I was so focused on short-term profits that I couldn't see the value of what you were offering." Geneva's voice became even quieter. "The criminal charges were dropped as part of my plea agreement, but I've been banned from holding management positions in manufacturing for 5 years. My insurance company paid most of the OSHA fines, but my reputation is destroyed. I'll never work in this industry again." She stood up to leave, then turned back for one final comment. "I wanted you to know that watching what you've accomplished has been the most educational part of this whole experience. You've shown me what real leadership looks like. What I was doing wasn't leadership, it was just exploitation with a nice title."
After Geneva left, I sat in my office, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 18 months earlier, I'd been a frustrated safety director, trying to convince a stubborn CEO to prioritize worker protection. Now I was helping workers across the country advocate for their own safety and working with companies that genuinely wanted to create better workplaces. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But it had been deeply satisfying in ways that my original position at Pinnacle never could have been. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler Thorne. "Astrid, my new company just asked me to lead a safety committee, using everything you taught us. Thanks for showing us that workers have power when they know how to use it." That message captured exactly why this work mattered. Geneva had tried to silence workers by calling them lazy and dismissing their concerns. But workers weren't lazy, they were underinformed and undersupported. When they had access to proper training and documentation tools, they became powerful advocates for their own protection. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I looked at the wall where I'd hung Geneva's TikTok video alongside the news coverage of OSHA's investigation. Not as a trophy but as a reminder of how quickly things could change when workers had the knowledge and tools they needed to advocate for themselves. Geneva's TikTok had been intended to showcase her tough management style and motivate her workers to complain less. Instead, it had triggered the most comprehensive workplace safety transformation in our region's history. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's building something so much better that the original injustice becomes irrelevant. And sometimes the people who try to silence you end up amplifying your message in ways they never could have imagined. Geneva thought her TikTok would go viral for showing strong leadership. She was right about it going viral, she was just wrong about everything else. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.